In war, the first casualty is the truth. You've probably wondered what people mean by that before, whether it's an exaggeration that sounds cool when rock stars say it, or if there is something more literal going on here. And it is kind of on the literal side, and it all has to do with how information works in a war zone. See, usually when we get our information, whether we get it from news or social media, they've kind of both become the same thing these days. We're looking at current events, so what's the weather going to be like? What are the main dangers and consequences that are happening around us today, beginning with who's been killed? And what's happening with our heroes? What new things are they into? In war, these things can actually help you and hurt an enemy, or it can be done the other way around. It can actually hurt you and help an enemy to have information about your community. And because of these variables, the information systems very quickly get shut down. Whether it's the internet going out, or the information systems get bombed, your electricity, for example, which is happening right now in Ukraine, or if there's something called a media blackout, which brings us to our first truth or lie part of this video, which is the Battle of Kherson. See, when information can be used for any purpose, good or bad, the government tries to shut it down. And this begins with the media. They actually send out an order to pretty much all the journalists, and they say to them, don't report on this. Please don't say anything about our military movements. In Ukraine's case, well, this video is about Ukraine. I have to get used to saying Ukraine. In Ukraine's case, they've said, especially, please don't report on the movements of our air force. And they've actually extended this to citizens. They're begging the citizens of Ukraine not to put out videos that show military movements. This form of censorship is actually way more common than you'd think. One very prominent example of it happening is actually in the Occupy Wall Street protests. For the entirety of September 2011, the media wasn't allowed to talk about the almost 100,000 people who were on Wall Street in New York City protesting. And that's because this could very easily lead to an actual revolution. So the government very quickly put the kibosh on it. And this happens quite frequently in regular protests. If you're in the middle of a big city during a major protest that has the potential to go violent, you'll actually find major parts of your phone not working. You may not be able to connect to the internet. For a while, your phone service may not work and you may not be able to call people. This is actually a very common thing that you do see in the media if you look for it. But again, it's one of those things that don't reach us on social media. And this is essentially what's happening in the region of Kherson right now. And this is why if you get news about Kherson and the battle, it's probably fake news. This city that the media, particularly in Ukraine, is not allowed to talk about is actually very strategically important. It's a big city on an important river that the Russians very much want to hold on to show that they have strength, and the Ukrainians want back for many reasons, partly because of all its bridges, many of which are gone now but can be repaired, and because of its other strategic importance, and to show that they are getting cities back. And this is why, for example, if you go on Twitter and look up Kherson, that's Kherson, you're actually going to get a lot of early reports about Ukrainian counteroffensives being blown back and hundreds of soldiers being killed and how great is Russia. The thing is, they all look like they've been written by one person. And remember, this is the first rule of astroturfing. If it looks like it was written by one person, it probably was. Our next fact or fiction is about Russia going nuclear. So they're wheeling out the nukes, right? I've seen videos of that train carrying the nuclear warhead. Putin keeps saying that they're going to bring out the nukes. Well, there are a couple of things you need to know for context. One is that during the Cold War, when nations began stockpiling their nukes, they came up with a strategy called mutually assured destruction. In fact, you can probably tell from the name, the strategy came up with itself. All these countries had nukes on them, and all of a sudden it became clear that if one great power used their nuclear weapons, the others would jump on them straight away. And this promise that if you use your nukes, we're going to use all of ours as well, became a promise that no one could use the nukes, or a big chunk of the human race would be wiped out and the rest would live very uncomfortably. In this way, every great nation assured that when they used nukes, it would instantly make the war unwinnable because they would lose far more than they gained, and there would no longer be any point to the war. This led to a strategy called brinkmanship, where great nations would come very close to using their nukes and step really near to that line to try and get compliance out of each other. The big example of this is the Cuban Missile Crisis, where in the early 1960s, Russia and the United States came very close to launching nukes. And in fact, an order from the Russian side did come to launch a nuclear weapon, but one of the many people who have to approve it said, "Nah, I think we've got this wrong. I think we've misinterpreted what we think is an explosion from the Americans at us." And in fact, this one person who did not give that clearance was correct. They weren't being attacked by Americans. They were actually just receiving a signal to a submarine to tell them to surface please so we can talk. So brinkmanship is a very dangerous strategy, but the great nations have found so far that it's worked. And so far, no one's really blown themselves up. There's an implicit understanding that it's not going to happen. This is why Russia has a strategy called escalating to de-escalate, where Putin specifically will threaten to use nuclear weapons and come closer and closer to a full invasion of countries you really don't want to invade because it will tip off World War III. The thing is, this is a bluff. Everyone knows it's a bluff, but on the other side, it's one of those threats you have to take seriously. Like when you go into an airport and if you mention something about having a bomb, even if they know you're joking, they have to treat you like you're being serious. For these reasons, and because of mutually assured destruction at large, it stands to reason that Russia can't use its nuclear weapons, and in a sane world won't. There are arguments that Russia is not acting in a sane way, and I have spoken before about how they have this brilliant strategy of doing chaotic things that should not make sense, because you don't expect them, and this gains them an edge in their geopolitical games. Particularly in hacking, you see this happening. They, for example, if there is a small army of people spreading fake news for them because they just like Russia a lot, which does happen, you do get nationalism, they still will grab a whole army of bots, or they will hire quite a few teenagers to spread fake news so that both things are going on. Nonetheless, to date, all the evidence of Russia using and preparing nuclear weapons has been debunked. Next, true or false? Ukraine's committing war crimes, right? Now, at this point, you may be noticing Betteridge's law, which is a fun little law on the internet that states, if a question is being asked on the internet, the answer is practically always no. Well, this one's a bit complicated. Now, under the Geneva Convention and many rules of war written after the Second World War, there are actually a lot of war crimes. Many things count as a war crime. Human shields, of course, firing on civilians. You can't torture people, you can't bomb non-combatants, you can't just kill people you've taken prisoner without giving them a trial. But there are some lesser-known war crimes that may not seem so obvious. For example, you can't play dead. You can't pretend that you've been killed and then wait for the enemy to come up to you. You can't make a spectacle of a prisoner of war. You can't put them in a cage and use them as a circus creature. And that includes press conferences. This will be important in a minute. And you can't put a military base too close to a civilian population. For example, a school or a hospital. And, Ukraine did that. And at the start of the war, there were many press conferences where captured Russians would actually say to the media, this is what happened, this is what we were ordered to do. We were ordered to commit war crimes. And ironically, this is actually both sides kind of owning up to not strictly following the rules at the same time. Now, war is hell, and Ukraine has said that when your city is being invaded, it's kind of impossible to strictly follow that rule about not putting your army inside a hospital because that's where the enemy's coming, especially when the enemy is committing war crimes. It reminds me of an excellent peace and conflict studies professor about 15 years ago at the University of California. I believe his name was Naylor, And he came up with Naylor's law, which is that if you have a non-violent protest and violence comes into it, it will equal violence. He always used the example of Gandhi, when they did things as non-violently as possible, and even when they were being massacred, they stuck to that non-violence. But they could only do that for so long. Eventually, they had to fight back. Their instincts kicked in, and their need to preserve their movement and their dignity kicked in, and violence followed. That will pretty much always happen. And we tend to see this, particularly in Eastern Europe, since the Balkan conflict. These things are kind of unavoidable, because what are you going to do when soldiers are knocking on your door saying, we're going to come and violate your family, we're taking all your stuff, we're going to brutalize and torture you? And that is what a UN commission has found. Answering to the UN's Human Rights Commission, they went into the Ukraine, I should really just say Ukraine, and they found that Russia was committing the vast majority of war crimes. This report came out very recently. They just gave it back less than a week ago as of recording this. And Russia was ticking all the boxes. The only two things you can call war crimes that have been associated with Ukraine that I can find confirmed are those press conferences and private videos being circulated of soldiers either being mistreated or just being put on display as prisoners of war, and putting the military into those school area zones, those hospitals, those places where there are dense civilian non-combatant populations.